Let's talk about gaslighting. So Neil Jacobson and John Gottman define gaslighting as a systematic attack on someone's perception of reality. Gaslighting is when your emotions, your words, and your felt experiences are being twisted and used against you in order to make you question your perception of reality. The term gaslighting comes from an old movie about a husband who wants to make his wife think she's insane, and so he starts turning the gas up and then denying that he's doing it. It's something that you often will see in an abusive relationship, and it is one of the tactics that makes it harder for someone to leave an abusive relationship. Neil Jacobson and John Gottman outline one of the most extreme forms of gaslighting in their book. Randy didn't like a comment Cheryl made, so he turned toward her, glared at her, and slapped her hard across the face. She turned to their neighbor Sam and said, "Did you see that?" Sam said, "I didn't see anything." Cheryl walked slowly into the house, dazed and confused. Her face hurt, but then again, maybe she had made it all up. Maybe she really was crazy. Randy said she made everything up, that all her troubles were in her mind, that he never hit her. He was so persuasive that Cheryl wasn't even sure what had really happened. It was a struggle for her to work on improving the clarity of her memory. She wrote all this down later so she could have documentation that she was not really crazy, that she had not imagined all this. This is a very effective form of emotional abuse because it causes the person being abused to question their own instincts, their perception of reality, and that leaves them much more vulnerable to the abuse, and it makes it much more difficult for them to leave. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, these are some techniques that you might see in a case of gaslighting. Withholding, meaning they refuse to listen or say they don't understand. Countering, when the abuser questions your memory of an event. Blocking or diverting, when the abuser changes the subject or questions the victim's thinking. Trivializing, making the victim's needs or feelings seem unimportant. Or forgetting and denial, when the manipulator pretends to have forgotten what actually happened or denies something that they had previously agreed to. My employer frequently used gaslighting techniques on me, even though I didn't identify that until a couple months ago. He would blame me when he lost his own temper, told me somehow it was my fault and I was responsible for it. He accused me of ignoring his texts when I was driving and he was constantly blowing my phone up. There was only one time I actually responded in anger to him that I can distinctly remember. He was yelling at me for something, and I snapped back at him and threw my pencil down on the table. And he proceeded to use the following gaslighting technique. He told me, "You're not supposed to react. You need to stay calm and have some emotional control when I'm talking to you," which was complete hypocrisy, but he was trying to make it appear as if he was the emotionally stable one and I was the reactive one. That's a form of gaslighting. Over time, this kind of abusive pattern can be really detrimental because it will make the victim not trust their own instincts. They'll stop trusting their own perception of reality, and they can start relying more and more on their perception of reality the abuser is creating. According to Robin Stern, these are some typical symptoms that you are experiencing gaslighting. If you constantly second guess yourself, if you are always asking yourself, "Am I being too sensitive?" If you frequently feel confused or like you're crazy, if it feels like you're the one who's always doing the apologizing, that's another symptom. If it feels like everything in your life should be going fine, but you're not happy. If you find yourself constantly making excuses for this person's behavior to friends or family members, or if you start withholding information so that you don't have to make excuses to your friends or family. If you know something feels wrong, but you don't know how to express it or articulate it. If you find yourself lying about the way they talk to you. If you suddenly have a really difficult time making simple decisions. If you feel suddenly hopeless and joyless. If you have the sense that you used to be a different person, more relaxed, more fun-loving, more confident. If you feel as if you can't do anything right around this person, and if you constantly question whether you're good enough. Gaslighting is just a very sophisticated form of hypocrisy. For example, my employer made a big show of how ethical and moral he was as a person, as a business owner, yet I could see him at the same time doing some pretty shady things on the side and cutting corners. He never took responsibility. He would always twist my words, make it as if I was really me who was at fault. At first, I really resented the way he would talk to me, but over time, I found myself doing the gaslighting work for him. I started making those excuses for his behavior and telling myself it wasn't really his fault. He has some Italian blood and he just never learned to control his emotions, and I'm Irish and I was raised in a Christian home where we were taught to control our emotions. So maybe he just yells at lazy people, or maybe he only yells at you if it's really important. But over time, when the yelling didn't stop, I started to realize that none of my excuses held any water. When someone's experiencing gaslighting, they will feel like they're living in a mental fog. They will oscillate from feeling stable and reassured to confused and unhinged. The analogy I like to pull from is the enchantment of Prince Rilian in the Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. So Prince Rilian is under an enchantment. He's been under it for 10 years and he doesn't know who he is. He is completely being deceived, but every single night he will have a fit where he knows who he is, he understands reality, and he'll try to escape. That's a really good analogy for gaslighting because you kind of feel like you're sane and insane at the same time. When Prince Rilian is under the enchantment, he feels so confident that he is fully sane and he knows who he is, and it's those nights when he has his fit and has to be tied down in the silver chair that he's insane. But what the children in the story realize is that when he's tied up in the silver chair having his fit, he claims that it was then that he is sane and the rest of the time he's enchanted. Sometimes I really felt like I was under some kind of spell, like I was insane, and I would question which version is the truth? Am I following reality when I think that my employer is not to blame for yelling at me? Or is it those little moments of clarity where I feel like he should be able to control himself? Is that the truth? The problem was I was always second guessing myself, and those moments where I thought maybe he shouldn't treat me that way, I would shake it off, I would dismiss them. And I frequently blamed myself. And the more I blamed myself, the more confused I became and the less I was really able to confidently question his treatment of me. And my perception of reality and my perception of myself really got warped. It felt like I was never improving at my job. I seemed to be constantly making mistakes and never growing as a person. I would feel incredibly guilty even if I hadn't really done anything. I was never getting praised the way I had at the beginning. I had gotten a lot of praise from my employer at the beginning, but the longer I worked there and the harder I worked and the more responsibilities I took on, the less I was acknowledged for my work, and it seemed as if I was becoming a worse employee over time rather than becoming more experienced. My employer was extremely suspicious. He was quite paranoid, and I started taking on some of his paranoia and suspicion. I would sometimes record random conversations he had with me to see if he would spontaneously begin yelling so I could have a record of it to show people if I felt like I needed to explain myself. I was really surprised at myself that I had become this paranoid that I needed to record him to prove to myself that he really was yelling at me. Gaslighting will make normal people behave in a way that is extremely paranoid. But I was not the only employee who was suffering from his gaslighting techniques. I had a coworker, in fact, who kept making mistakes in the bookkeeping, and she was convinced that she had some kind of number dyslexia, that there was something wrong with her. In reality, I believe she was making mistakes because she was being harangued constantly and because of his belligerence, and it was induced by stress. But like many victims of gaslighting, she assumed the problem was her reaction to the abuse, not the abusive behavior itself. I also noticed over time I was having a very negative reaction to all the belligerence. I became really afraid of leaving that company because I didn't have the confidence I would be able to make it out there in the real world, which was not an idea that originated from me. That was an idea planted by my employer. The stress, though, started to have a physical toll on my body as well. I would have bouts where I couldn't sleep, or I would completely lose my hunger drive. I didn't want to eat anything, alternating with bouts where I felt ravenously hungry all day, like it's 10 o'clock in the morning and I am starving. One thing I also realized when I finally left that company and started working somewhere else is that Over time, I had become addicted to my stress hormones. When your body is being flooded with stress hormones like adrenaline, cortisol, it can get addicted to that rush of there being a constant crisis that needed to be solved, and the good feeling that I would get when I did solve the crisis was incredibly addictive. I felt very bored at other companies where there wasn't a constant crisis and no one was yelling at me. And that was something I had to work through and understand that I needed to get over this addiction to my stress hormone. What was really important though was I did have moments of rebellion. I would sometimes write down how I really felt and my own perspective on him. I would write them on slips of paper and hide them under my keyboard right at the main front desk. The fact that I was writing out my own version of reality, my own perception, in defiance of his, write out how I really felt about his behavior, and I was leaving it hidden in a fairly obvious place, helped give me the pluck I needed to finally walk away. One thing though I will definitely say is that what makes abuse and gaslighting more complicated is these are real people. These are not Saturday morning cartoons. My employer was a really fun guy to work for. He was goofy, he was always making self-deprecating jokes, he brought a lot of energy. When we did well, he was over the moon and excited and praising everybody. He was fun to be around, and that made it much more complicated. But there was one day that was a major tipping point for me where I finally saw through a lot of his lies. So one day, a friend stopped by the office to see my boss and chat with him. They were hanging out in the basement where his office was, and I didn't usually work down there, but I had to for a reason. There was some software I needed to use on a computer down there that was not at the main desk. My boss didn't know I was down there though, so he was just chatting with his friend, relaxing, having a nice time. This friend was from a rougher background though, and was using a lot of foul language. My boss did not realize I was within earshot, and so he started to respond in kind to fit in. He started peppering his sentences with foul language and F-bombs. Now you have to understand, my boss had never cursed at me. No matter how angry he got, I had never heard foul language come out of his mouth. And I had just assumed that he was just not that kind of person. He just didn't have those words in his vocabulary. When I was sitting there listening to him pepper his sentences with F-bombs, every other word, it finally clicked for me that he was lying to me. We store curse words in a different part of our brain than normal vocabulary words, and we access them in extreme moments of emotion. I sat there and I was listening to him curse, and I realized he was in control when he yelled at me. He was not out of control. He was not losing his temper, because if he really was out of control, he would have cursed at me because he had those words in his vocabulary. He had no compunction about using those words. He was choosing to yell. That was a decision he was making, and he was exercising a degree of restraint. He wasn't yelling at me so much that I would quit, because he knew if he actually used bad language at me, that would be negatively reflected in an office situation, and it might push me far enough that I quit. He was gauging his level of anger, he was exercising a degree of control, and he knew how far he could push me. And it made me finally realize that he had self-restraint and he was culpable for how he talked to me. Gaslighting is essentially identity erosion. Gaslighting techniques strip the victim of their self-confidence and their independence by making them question their own sanity. Some good tips for someone who needs to recover from gaslighting is keep a journal. Write out your thoughts, because that will help you to mark dates and times when this person said this to you, and it helps you reestablish a sense of reality. Talking to another person can also help give you an objective point of view. But honestly, the most difficult part about gaslighting that you have to recover from is learning to trust your own instincts, learning to trust your own emotional reactions, and letting yourself feel your own emotions. It takes a while to regain trust in other people, to understand that you're allowed to have your emotional reactions and you don't need to explain them away or justify your feelings to other people. What's actually really important is expressing self-compassion, because someone who's experiencing abuse will often blame themselves, condemn themselves, and having sympathy for yourself, not self-love. Expressing some objective self-compassion is a really important part of the healing process. In my opinion, someone who's exercising gaslighting techniques is basically setting themselves up as a false god. God invented the world, he invented reality, and he did it through his words. Someone who's exercising gaslighting techniques is basically doing a mockery of that. They're trying to rewrite reality with their words by twisting other people's words. They are reframing events, and they redefine what is right and what is wrong. One thing I had to do was kind of retrain my conscience. I had become hyper vigilant. I had felt like other people's emotions are my responsibility, and I was constantly hunting under the bed for the dust bunnies of sin in my conscience. I was on high alert. There was one day when I listened to a sermon that said, rather than constantly introspecting and hunting for sin, just pray with open hands. And the pastor advocated just take a moment and ask God that if there are any sins you've been ignoring, that he would make it clear to you. And I remember thinking, oh, I should try that. So I paused the sermon and I just prayed, Lord, if there's any sin that I'm holding on to that is hidden in the corners that I can't see, make it clear to me. And if I don't get a prompting, then I will know that I don't need to worry about it. And then this thought occurred to me. And I am not a charismatic, but I do think this was the prompting of the Holy Spirit. The thought came to me, Emily, you really think you're better than everyone else, don't you? And I just sort of sat there and I was like, I don't know where that thought came from, but it was very true. It had the ring of truth. And then it made me think of a specific person and a specific instance where I had been extremely contemptuous. Not outwardly, but I had a lot of contempt in my heart and a lot of pride. And I was shocked. I was sitting there thinking, oh, I am proud and I do have contempt and I look down on people. And I was able to repent and just move on. It was really helpful for me as I recalibrated that my conscience was able to identify that guilt should be specific, not a vague, nameless sense of shame, but a specific, clear prompting. And reestablishing that clarity in my conscience was a really important part of my growth. I'm going to leave you with John 8, verses 31 and 32. So Jesus said to the Jews who believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free."